Sex, scandal, naked dancing, and enormous quantities of cocaine. When people think about Berlin, there's one name that they often come to: Anita Berber. My name's Jason Collings, and I write the Alaric von Trelow Mysteries. I'm going to talk to you about the embodiment of Weimar Berlin's decadence. Anita Berber, also known as the High-Priestess of Depravity. When people think of Weimar Berlin, they tend to picture a haze of cabaret, cigarette smoke, silk stockings, jazz, and moral collapse, all artfully lit and slightly unreal, as though the whole city existed only to give later generations something to fantasize about. And sooner or later, if you follow that image long enough, you arrive at Anita Berber. Not because she was typical, because she was clearly not, but because she seemed to embody in one unnerving, concentrated person so much of what the city had become after the Great War. Theatrical, excessive, sexually charged, unstable, willfully shocking, and always on the edge of another reinvention or ruin. She was the 1920s Madonna, Janis Joplin, Amy Winehouse, and a dozen more scandalous, self-destructive stars all rolled into one and then turned up to the maximum. She's one of those figures who seem almost too perfectly suited to their moment. If Berlin in the 20s had wanted to invent a patron saint of scandal, it couldn't have done better. That's why she was the High Priestess of Depravity, an icon of excess and ruinous glamour. And the details, of course, are irresistible. They're part of the reason why she survives in memory. According to various biographical accounts, she breakfasted on white rose petals soaked in ether. She wore a locket the size of a fist filled with cocaine. For a period, she carried a pet baby chimp around with her, wrapped around her neck. And one of her favourite stunts was to walk into a nightclub wearing a long fur coat and high, shiny black boots, to remove the coat to show that the boots was all she was wearing underneath. And she would then, uninvited, take to the stage and perform it naked other than for her boots. One story tells of 3 hussar officers all trying to outdo each other to impress her, until she cut through the competition in exasperation and told them all to shut up. She'd just sleep with them all. Then there's the Adlon story. The Adlon, the finest, most famous hotel in Berlin, right by the Brandenburg Gate. She kept a suite there for a while, paid for by her various male admirers, and the question as to why the Adlon put up with it was discussed. And the answer was because the management of the Adlon considered that if people knew that they could keep Anita Berber's secrets, anybody else's would certainly be safe with them. One can excite all this and can still miss the point, because what really matters about Anita Berber is not that she behaved outrageously. Berlin was full of outrageous people. What made her important was that she made herself into a spectacle with such force, such intelligence, and complete contempt for conventional restraint, that she ceased to be merely a performer, a dancer, an actress, and became instead an iconic symbol of a city. And that started on the stage, because Berber wasn't simply notorious in her private life. Her actual performances were scandalous too. Sometimes in style, naked dancing was one of her fortes, sometimes in content, sometimes simply in the names under which they were advertised. She danced pieces called Cocaine, Morphium, Suicide, Abortion. Even before one gets to what she did on stage, those titles tell you a lot about the world she inhabited and the audience she was playing to. This wasn't scandal by accident. This was scandal framed, titled, sold, and consumed. The provocation was built into the program. That's one of the things people forget when they sentimentalize Weimar decadence. They talk as if it were just freedom in better clothes. But there's something harder, stranger, and more aggressive about it. Berber's performances didn't merely invite admiration. What they did was challenge, disturb, bait. They fascinated. They made vice theatrical. They turned bodily and social taboo into material. They took things that respectable society didn't want to look at, preferred to hide away, whether it was drugs, sexual freedom, lesbianism, gender ambiguity, abortion, self destruction, and dragged them out under the lights and set them to dance. And that wasn't just being daring, it was a cultural assault. This was over 100 years ago. And Berlin loved it, or at least it loved being shocked by it. And that matters because Berlin after 1918 was not simply a glamorous capital suddenly set loose. It was a city swollen with contradictions. Empires had collapsed. Men had come back from war, altered and broken. Women wanted their own lives, their own freedom. Money had become unstable. Refugees and exiles poured in. The old order had collapsed. New elites announced themselves with noise, money, and sex appeal. Political life became brittle, more theatrical, more savage. A city like that develops an appetite. It wants novelty, sensation, transgression, new idols, new vices, new styles of chaos. It wants to feel modern, and modernity often arrives dressed as permissiveness. Anita Berber understood that instinctively. She understood that in a city full of people trying to become someone else, someone new, performance was no longer confined to the stage. It spilled out into hotels, cafes, nightclubs, private parties, relationships, newspaper columns, and even in the way one moved through a room. Persona itself became currency. Notoriety opened doors. Visibility established one's status. To be discussed, to be talked about, to be an object of shock was to have won, at least for the moment. And Anita Berber was discussed everywhere. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty alone wouldn't have done it. There were plenty of beautiful girls in Berlin. What she possessed was something more volatile. Theatrical nerve, complete fearlessness about scandal, and the rare star quality by which a person can make every room feel slightly rearranged just by their arrival. One can see why audiences were transfixed by her. And one can also see why wealthy men, board officers, fascinated women, hotel managers, journalists, voyeurs, patrons, all manner of hangers-on found reasons to orbit around her. She was one of those people who seemed to force others into repose. And that didn't make her admirable. And this is where the sentimental version of Anita Berber has to be put aside, because it's much too easy to take a woman who scandalized bourgeois society and convert her into a heroine of liberation. Anita Berber wasn't that simple. She wasn't merely liberated. The biographical record gives us someone who's far harsher than that, someone manipulative, cruel, voracious, often selfish, sometimes predatory. She would use people, she would humiliate them, she would dominate lovers, exploit emotional dependence, behave with extraordinary selfishness, and move through intimacy as though other people existed simply to feed her own appetites. That ugliness is also part of the story, and it has to stay there. Otherwise, you end up with a decorative myth where the human being ought to be. But in a way, that story belongs to Berlin too, because the city didn't just reward glamour, it rewarded intensity, it rewarded nerve, it rewarded the people who could make themselves larger than ordinary morality, at least for a while. It blurred the line between freedom and appetite, between daring and destructiveness, liberation and indifference to consequence. Anita Berber was not outside that culture. If she had been, she wouldn't have been a success. What she is one of its purest expressions. That's why she still feels modern. And I don't mean that in a lazy sense of nothing changes. I don't mean that also that Berlin was exactly like any city today, because clearly it wasn't. But there are patterns here that arrived early and they've never really left us. The public fascination with self invention, the elevation of notoriety into a kind of cultural capital, the way private damage can become a public style, and the way audiences consume figures who seem to embody both freedom and collapse all at once. I mentioned a couple of names earlier: Janis Joplin, Amy Winehouse. There are many, many others. But in many ways, Anita Berber was the first. And Berlin was the stage on which she danced and performed, and it was ultimately the beast that consumed her. Even the famous details, the ether-soaked rose petals and the cocaine locket, the pet chimp and the nakedness under the fur coat, all the lovers, all the hotel suites, the nightclubs, they matter for more than their sensation. They show in Anita Berber a woman who understood that life itself could be staged, and that in Weimar Berlin, the distance between performance and identity was very thin indeed. They also show a public that was willing, even eager, to turn a person into a legend while she was still busy destroying herself in front of them. And that, in the end, is what makes Anita Berber so useful if you're trying to understand Weimar Berlin. She isn't merely a colourful anecdote from a decadent age. She's evidence. Evidence of a city intoxicated by spectacle, by social instability, by sexual display, by danger, by playing a role, by new freedoms and ugly appetites and strange excitement that comes when old rules are being torn up and nobody yet knows what the new ones will be. She danced pieces called Cocaine and Morphium because Berlin was ready to watch those things become art. She could scandalize a nightclub by stripping out of a fur coat because Berlin made itself exactly the kind of city where that gesture could become legend. She could live publicly at the edge of collapse because there was a whole urban culture eager to see collapse as style and art, provided it was sufficiently beautiful. And so, yes, Anita Berber was outrageous. But to me, that's one of the least interesting things about her. What's more fascinating is that she became the perfect performer to embody the city of Berlin at that time. a place that had begun to confuse display with truth and sensation with vitality, notoriety with significance. She didn't just live in Weimar Berlin, she showed it to itself. Exaggerated, narcotic, sexually charged, cruel, brilliant, hungry, self conscious, and already half in love with its own self destruction. That's why Anita Berber lasts. Not merely because she shocked people, because she revealed the age. Anita Berber died at the age of 29. Weimar Germany would last only 14 years. And 12 years after it failed, Berlin itself would be obliterated. She was the perfect embodiment of the city. And so, if you want to understand the world behind the Alaric von Trelow Mysteries, the books I write, the glamour, the vice, the appetite, the danger, the theatre of modernity, I think Anita Berber's one of the doors through which you have to enter it.